in that process.
Does the Finance Committee wish to speak on their motion to amend? Mr. Dodge.
What we're really coming down here is a philosophical question. The way that the Board of Selectmen and the Town Administrator want to go is the fact that we appropriate the funds up front without really knowing what the costs are going to be, with the hopes that whatever figure is in that line item, the negotiations will stay within that dollar amount. Finance Committee is taking the standpoint of, we feel that the contract should be signed before April town meeting. We know there's a challenge in doing that, but we feel that town meeting has the right to know what these costs are going to be before the fact, not after the fact. The contracts should be in place. We should know what the dollar value will be, what the cost will be for this year, as well as the second year or third year, or however long the contract is. The other point is the fact that with the limited funds we have, I think we feel that it's even more imperative that the contracts be signed before town meeting. Back a few years ago, the majority of the contracts were already signed before town meeting, with very few lapping over to the summer time frames. Now we've completely flip-flopped to the opposite, where we come to town meeting and we have no contracts signed for fiscal year 93.
Mr. Venezia.
Gerald Venezia, 9 Pine Glen Drive. Again, Mr. Dodge has stated that there is a difference of opinion between the Board of Selectmen and the majority of the Finance Committee. And the philosophical difference is whether or not contracts should be signed, sealed, and delivered when we come to town meeting. The Board of Selectmen has had some extensive discussions with the Town Administrator regarding this matter. And it's our feeling that it is not a favorable position for us to be in, to have to be forced into negotiating and signing a contract prior to town meeting, nor is it very realistic in this day and age. There's very, very little to work with. Negotiations for this fiscal 92 has involved very little change in the existing contract, and there's no real reason for the other side to agree to a contract under these terms. It's almost impossible for us, and I think the school committee over the last couple of years has been in the same position, to come to town meeting with a signed contract. Our feeling, and I thought this was somewhat of a unique approach this year, to put a line item in here for compensation change, was to come to town meeting and ask town meeting to have a voice in the actual collective bargaining that we would be doing over the next fiscal year for the next fiscal year contract. And what we're asking is for town meeting to say, hey, look, this is the amount that we feel should be budgeted for collective bargaining. Go out and negotiate contracts within this amount. If it's not $103,000, what is it? The other way of doing this is for us to try to negotiate contracts, to come back to town meeting and say, well, this is what we negotiated, and then determine whether or not we're going to get money to fulfill the contracts. Our alternative is, if we don't get the support from town meeting, we're faced with a situation where we've negotiated contracts, and perhaps now the only way for us to live up to the representations we've made is to make cuts someplace in the government so that we can satisfy those representations that we've made. We're asking you to tell us, look, this is what we think this year you should do for collective bargaining, or at least give us a suggestion. The amount that's represented here, $103,000, I think if we were to spend that entire amount, and in no way, shape, or form are we representing to you that we're going to spend the entire amount, but I think that would come out in the vicinity of someplace around 2.5% to 3% if we were to spend it all, and that would cover all of our municipal employees. And I can tell you right now, obviously I cannot tell you right now exactly how much of that would be spent. But we're asking, again, for some directions, some guidelines with this particular budget item. And we think it's a reasonable amount of money for us to work with in dealing fairly and responsibly with town employees who we think have done a very good job of trying to do more with less over the last couple of years. And we think that we need to deal fairly with them. We feel we need to negotiate with them and represent to them that we're doing this in good faith in return for the services that they're performing for the town. Thank you.
Mr. Pasquale.
I'm Pasquale, 12 Hickory Lane. I fully support the Finance Committee for several reasons. First of all, we're going to have a Me Too attitude with the school department because they want to have $70,000. This is not negotiation, ladies and gentlemen, when you put something down concrete and you sit across the table from Mr. Pasquale and I say to you, geez, if you got $103,000, you must have some more. That's not negotiation. The second thing that bothers me is that some of these contracts should have been settled much earlier in the year. I myself have walked around the town and spoken to employees in the DPW that are still waiting for an answer since November on a contract. That is a disgrace in my estimation. Those contracts should be settled one way or the other. You've been just dragging on these things, so I favor what the Finance Committee supports. Settle these things in February sometime. I listened to this argument of bargaining in good faith. For whose good faith is it? For the union people to tell them when you're sitting across, well, we might have something? I think it ought to be zero. That's the way you negotiate.
Mr. O'Brien.
Mr. O'Brien, 95 Park Street. I'm in sympathy with the Finance Committee's position on this. Some of the reasons Mr. Pasquale has just pointed out. More importantly, I'd like to know where this figure of $103,000 came from, how it was arrived at. And I'd also like to know if indeed the Board of Selectmen earlier on this year provided parameters to the town administrator to work with him in negotiations. I believe that town meeting should be able to deal with contracts that are on the side. And again, that agrees with what the problem says. But please, would somebody answer my question as to how this $150,000 was arrived at, and if indeed the Board of Selectmen did give guidance to the town administrator and set parameters for negotiations. I know that's happened in the past, but it appears this Board of Selectmen is operating in a different way.
Mrs. Cerrone.
Mr. Moderator, just to answer Mr. O'Brien's questions and then also Mrs. Pasquale's. Mr. Bryan, yes, goals and objectives were established with the Board of Selectmen and the town administrator. As all of you, if you deja vu back a year ago, we budgeted zero for cost increase. And we have come to terms with 2 contracts that are near settlement with a 0%. And the goals and objectives that were set forth by the Board of Selectmen were to work to get some rights back, but yet understanding that these people have families. 0% is pretty consistent along with the business as well. The dollar amount that's being represented in the $103,000 is no more than 2.5% across the board for every single union that the general government side works and bargains with. I think what's important here is that we did do 0% last year, and we're looking at, Mr. Pasquale alluded to one of the unions. They're looking for money, and if we don't have anything to offer them, we're going to be bouncing the rubber ball back to special town meeting, back to town meeting. You're going to say yes, you're going to say no, we're going back to the unions. And in the meantime, you're looking at mediation costs. And so what we're looking for is a ballpark. We're looking at no more than 2.5%. Maybe the feeling in the audience is 1.5%, and we could make that deduction from the $103,000. But we need a guideline so that the administrator knows what he can bargain with for 93 and 94, and in some cases also 92. And I think that responsibility in every one of your businesses, your bosses, your senior managers, they incorporate some sort of money for cost of living increase and or raises and or, if you will, bonuses because you've been an outstanding employee or whatever. And we're looking for that same level of responsibility here as well, is we need to appropriate some sort of dollar amount so that our personnel can be rewarded by way of contract.
Mr. Walsh.
Mike Walsh, Duane Drive. I'd like to make just 2 points regarding this line item. Most of us, when we look at this budget that we have before us, it's kind of confusing. It's a lot to kind of try to digest. Some of us have just seen it for the first time. Some of us have done some homework on it. The people that have done the most homework on this budget are the FinCom. They've looked at this, they've been working on this for a long time. If anyone's going to recommend anything, it should be the FinCom. They've done the most homework on it, and if they say that that's what we should do, that's what we should do. I don't think that we should have to discuss it. They've done their homework. The second point regarding this is if we talked about the town employees and the true feelings of negotiation with the town employees and that they should be rewarded with cost of living increases and things like that, I guarantee that every one of the employees has been too long without a raise in the town. But if that was the true purpose of going into negotiations with the town employees, we wouldn't have a budget that has added 6 or 8 new positions and only certain position upgrades throughout it. The true feelings of the town should be to reward those employees in the budget, and don't take that away first by adding positions that don't give the employees the benefits they deserve. We're adding management positions, we're adding positions at the top. We're not adding people in the payroll departments and the clerical departments. We're adding bosses. If we're going to deal with them fairly, deal with them up front, get the contracts out of the way before you come to the town meeting, and treat them fairly. Don't go backdoor like we're doing right now.
Mr. Dodge.
Mr. Venanzia a few minutes ago said that the town meeting should get involved with the collective bargaining or whatever. That's entirely correct. What town meeting needs to say here tonight is whether or not they want the contracts in hand before April town meeting or after the fact. Just because the dollar amount is $103,000 in that line item doesn't say anything that the contracts have to come in within that dollar figure. I mean, there's many games that can be played during collective bargaining. We've seen things in the past where increases were implemented halfway through the year at maybe 3%, which means the beginning of the following fiscal year, it's really a cost of 6% to you. I think at some point we have to take a stand and say, we as town meeting, how we feel collective bargaining should be done.
Mr. Daly.
I'd like to make a couple of follow-up remarks. First, with regard to the concerns of expression about bargaining in good faith, I think is a proper representation with the general government employees. When you have nothing to work with, it's extremely difficult to cut a deal. That's the situation that I've been in for the last 18 months with regard to collective bargaining. Nonetheless, we've managed to bring in 2 contracts with no increase in wages for the present fiscal year. We have no contracts that are even being bargained for the next fiscal year. The major difference in philosophy here is one that hinges on the present economic situation, not just of the government, but the entire region. As Mr. Venezia said, it's difficult for employee collective bargaining units to find an incentive to settle a contract before the town meeting when the general economic condition is such that there's very little money to work with. If we can have this appropriation to work with, then I believe that we'll be able to close those contracts, settle those contracts for the next fiscal year, and we can do it successfully within a fairly short period of time. One of the persons who just spoke suggested that I perhaps have not been treating the employees fairly by there being a deal on the table with one union as long ago as November, and I think the expression was that the town's been dragging its feet in trying to get this approved. Well, that's not at all the case, because I'm here to represent, I sit at the bargaining table rather to represent the selectmen and represent all of you in what's going to be paid to the town employees. And at the point where I feel that there's an arrangement, a deal struck that's fair to both parties and that the town can afford, then I bring it to the selectmen. In the case of this particular union, that hasn't been the case until within the last 3 or 4 weeks. It's important for us to be able to bargain in good faith. And for me to sit and argue with the unions that the town has no money has been an unproductive approach. It's historically